The metal toe of Alastair Finch's $1,000 shoe nudged the sodden edge of the cardboard box. Rain from the night before had turned the alley into a slick, grimy mirror reflecting the bruised twilight sky. His security chief, a burly man named Harris, whose shoulders seemed to strain the very fabric of his suit, grunted as he bent to haul the box away. It was the last piece of refuse in an otherwise cleared-out hovel of a laneway. A blight Alastair had acquired for a pittance and would soon transform into a gleaming tower of glass and profit. "Just toss it in the dumpster, Harris. I want this entire block sanitized by morning." His voice was crisp, impatient, the same voice that had liquidated companies and shattered careers without a flicker of emotion. But as Harris gripped the cardboard, a small, sleepy voice piped up from within, clear as a bell in the damp air. "Please, sir, that's my house." Harris froze, his thick fingers recoiling as if he'd touched a live wire. Alastair's perfectly sculpted mask of indifference twitched. He stepped forward, peering down as a tiny, grime-smudged hand pushed a flap open. A pair of enormous, impossibly green eyes blinked up at him, followed by a face that didn't belong in a damp box in a forgotten alley. It was a face he knew better than his own. It was the ghost of his wife, Alara, shrunk into the frame of a 6-year-old child. The city's cacophony faded to a dull roar in his ears. The world, for the first time in a decade, tilted on its axis. Alastair couldn't breathe. It was a physical sensation, a crushing weight on his chest, as if the skyscraper he planned to build had been erected directly upon his ribs. Harris was still frozen, his professional composure utterly shattered, looking at Alastair for a cue that his training had never prepared him for. The little girl shuffled inside her box, the rustling sound amplified in the sudden profound silence that had enveloped them. She pulled the flap a little closer, as if to guard herself against the two giants looming over her home. Her eyes, those impossible eyes, were wide with a fear that was ancient and weary, a fear no child should ever know. They were Elira's eyes, when she'd first told him she was pregnant, a look of joyful terror that had made his heart swell to bursting. They were Elira's eyes in the hospital, dimmed by pain, but still fighting, still focused on him. Alastair felt a tremor start in his hands, a tremor he hadn't felt since the night he'd held her cold, lifeless hand and begged a silent God for a trade he knew would never be accepted. "Get away from it," Alastair rasped, the words scraping his throat. Harris took a half step back, confused. "Sir, I said get back." Alastair's voice was sharper now, cutting through his own shock. He crouched down, the fine Italian wool of his trousers creasing as they met the grimy pavement. He ignored the filth, the stench of decay and dampness. He was now on her level. The face was even more staggering up close. The same delicate sweep of the cheekbones, the same stubborn set of her small chin, the spray of faint freckles across her nose that were only visible in the summer sun on Alara. Her hair was a tangled, matted mess of dark curls, but he just knew, that if you washed it and brushed it, it would hold the same auburn highlights when the light hit it just right. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he'd intended, softer than he'd used in years. The girl hesitated, pulling a threadbare blanket up to her chin. "Lily," she whispered. Lily. Alara had always wanted to name their daughter Lily. They had talked about it on a Sunday afternoon. Sunlight streaming through the window of their first tiny apartment. A lifetime ago. A lifetime before the money, before the empire, before the emptiness. "Where are your parents, Lily?" he asked, the question feeling hollow and absurd. She just shook her head, a slow, final gesture that spoke of a story already finished. "Just me now," she said, her voice small but not self-pitying. It was a statement of fact. Alistair felt the cold, hard shell he'd built around his heart begin to crack. It was a terrifying, agonizing sensation, like thawing from frostbite. He could feel again, and the first feeling was a decade of grief rushing back in a single, gut-wrenching wave. He reached a hand out, slowly, his fingers still trembling. Lily flinched, but she didn't retreat. He let his fingers gently touch her cheek. Her skin was cold, but it was real. This wasn't a hallucination. This was a little girl who looked like his dead wife, sleeping in a box on a property he was about to demolish. He made a decision. It wasn't logical. It wasn't rational. It violated every rule of detached, calculated existence he lived by. It was an impulse born from a ghost's memory. He stood up, towering over her once more. "Harris," he said, his voice regaining its command, but with a new, unfamiliar timbre. "Cancel the sanitation crew and get the car. Now." Harris, ever the professional, simply nodded, his relief palpable. "Yes, sir. Where are we going?" Alistair looked down at the box, at the impossible face peeking out from it. "Home," he said, the word feeling foreign and strange on his tongue. He bent down again. "Lily," he said gently, "how would you like to get out of this box?" The journey to his penthouse was a study in surreal contrasts. Lily sat on the plush leather of the Rolls-Royce, a tiny, silent figure swallowed by opulent silence. She didn't touch anything. She just stared out the window at the blur of city lights, her reflection a faint, grimy ghost against the gleaming glass. Alistair sat opposite her, unable to look away, tracing the lines of her face with his eyes, each familiar curve a fresh stab of pain and wonder. The car smelled of rich leather and his expensive cologne, but he could still faintly smell the damp cardboard and rain on her clothes. Harris drove with his eyes fixed firmly on the road, a silent partition between him and the bizarre tableau in the back. What was he supposed to do with her? The question hammered at Alistair. Social services. That was the logical, responsible answer. A clean handoff. He could set up a trust fund, ensure she was cared for from a distance. A charitable act to assuage this sudden, violent resurgence of guilt. It would be neat, clinical. But the thought of handing her over to strangers, of letting that face disappear into the sterile anonymity of the system, felt like losing Alara all over again. He couldn't do it. Not yet. The elevator ascended the 90 floors to his penthouse in a whisper of polished steel and glass. When the doors opened directly into his living space, Lily gasped. Her small sound was the first genuine reaction she'd had since leaving the alley. Alistair saw his home through her eyes for the first time. A cavernous expanse of white marble, black leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the glittering city like a jeweler's collection. It was cold, sterile, and meticulously ordered. A museum of wealth, not a home. He had designed it to be empty, a fortress against feeling. Now, with this tiny, disheveled child standing in the middle of it, it just looked lonely. "Are you hungry?" he asked, the domestic question feeling clumsy in his mouth. Lily nodded, her eyes still huge as she took in the scale of the room. He led her to the kitchen. a gleaming landscape of stainless steel and black granite that his housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, kept in a state of surgical cleanliness. He opened the massive, computer-controlled refrigerator. It was filled with bottled water, expensive cheeses, a bottle of champagne, and some organic vegetables he never touched. Nothing a child would eat. He stared at the contents, completely flummoxed. For a man who could negotiate a billion-dollar merger, the simple act of feeding a hungry child felt like an impossible task. He remembered Ilara in their small kitchen, humming as she made grilled cheese sandwiches, the smell of melting butter, and bread filling the tiny apartment with a warmth that had nothing to do with money. The memory was so vivid, he could almost smell it. He closed the refrigerator door. "I'll order something," he said, more to himself than to her. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the icon for his personal concierge. What did kids eat? Pizza? He settled on that, ordering an absurd amount from the city's most expensive artisanal pizzeria. While they waited, he faced the next challenge. "You should take a bath," he said, trying to sound gentle. He led her to one of the 6 guest bathrooms. This one was larger than his first apartment. A vast slab of marble held 2 sinks, and a glass-walled shower stood next to a bathtub that could have fit 4 people. Lily stared at it all, her expression unreadable. Alistair turned on the water, fumbling with the minimalist chrome fixtures, until warm water streamed into the tub. He added a generic-smelling bath gel from a bottle that had likely been sitting there, untouched for years. He turned to her. "Can you—" He trailed off, the reality hitting him. She was a little girl. She probably couldn't bathe herself. A fresh wave of panic, hot and suffocating, washed over him. He had no idea what to do. He thought of Mrs. Gable, but it was her night off. He was alone with this small, silent ghost. "I'll be right outside the door," he said finally, his voice strained. "Call if you need anything." He left the room, closing the door behind him and leaning against it, his heart pounding. He heard the small click of the lock. He stood there for a long time, listening to the faint sounds of splashing water, feeling more helpless and terrified than he had in any boardroom. This was a world he didn't know, a world of softness and vulnerability he had long since abandoned. It was Ilara's world, and now, somehow, it had found its way into his. The pizza arrived, and Alistair set it on the massive glass dining table. A few minutes later, the bathroom door opened. Lily emerged, wrapped in a fluffy white towel that was far too big for her damp hair clinging to her small face. She looked cleaner, but also smaller and more vulnerable than before. Alistair had laid out a T-shirt of his, which on her looked like a dress, reaching her ankles. She padded silently to the table and stared at the pizza boxes. He opened one, revealing a pie with prosciutto and figs. Her nose wrinkled. He opened another. "Quattro formaggi." She shook her head. The final one was a simple margarita. Her eyes lit up. He served her a slice on a piece of fine china, a ridiculous juxtaposition. She ate with a quiet, desperate ferocity that twisted his gut. She ate 3 slices before she finally slowed down, her small stomach clearly not used to so much food. He hadn't eaten a single bite. He just watched her, this enigma, who looked like his past and was now sitting at his table, devouring a $20 slice of pizza. After she was finished, a sleepy haze settled over her. Her eyelids began to droop. Alistair led her to another guest room, This one with a king-sized bed that seemed to float in the center of the room, facing a window with a panoramic view of the city. He pulled back the heavy duvet. The sheets were crisp, white, and probably had a thread count higher than his credit score. Lily crawled onto the bed, looking like a tiny doll in a vast empty landscape. She curled into a small ball in the very center. "The box was warmer," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. The words were a soft, unintentional indictment of his entire life. He had 100 windows, but no warmth. He pulled the duvet over her, tucking it around her small shoulders. He stood there for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. In the dim light from the city below, with her face relaxed in sleep, the resemblance to Alara was so profound it was painful. He felt an overwhelming urge to protect this child, an instinct he thought had died with his wife. He backed out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, and walked back into his sterile living room. The city lights glittered below him, a kingdom he had conquered. But inside, he was in uncharted territory. He sank onto one of the black leather sofas, the silence of the penthouse pressing in on him. He wasn't a father. He was a predator. In a suit, a man who consumed and destroyed. What was he doing? He should have called the authorities from the alley. He should have let the system handle it. But he hadn't. He had brought the alley into his penthouse. He had brought the ghost into his home. He looked at his hands. They had signed contracts worth billions. They had shaken hands with kings and presidents. They had never once tucked a child into bed. He ran a hand over his face, the exhaustion hitting him like a physical blow. It wasn't just tiredness from the day. It was a deep, soul-crushing weariness that had been accumulating for 10 years. He looked towards the guest room. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't alone in his empty fortress. And he was terrified. Not of her, but of what she represented. A life he had lost. A man he had forgotten how to be. A heart he had deliberately, meticulously, and successfully buried. And now, a little girl with his wife's eyes was sleeping down the hall, threatening to dig it all up. The next morning, Alistair woke on the sofa, a crick in his neck, and the unfamiliar feeling of disorientation. The sun was streaming through the windows, making dust motes dance in the air. For a moment, he forgot. Then he heard it, a small humming sound from the direction of the kitchen. He got up and walked quietly towards the sound. Lily was standing on a dining chair. She'd pushed up to the counter, trying to reach a glass from a high cabinet. She was still wearing his t-shirt. She had found a brush somewhere and had attempted to tame her wild curls, with minimal success. He watched her for a moment, this tiny domestic scene playing out against the backdrop of his aggressively undomestic life. "Good morning," he said, his voice husky with sleep. She jumped, startled, and nearly fell off the chair. He lunged forward and steadied her. "I was thirsty," she said, as if expecting to be reprimanded. "I can get that for you," he said, reaching up and easily retrieving a glass. He filled it with water from the filtered tap and handed it to her. She drank it all in one go. The silence stretched between them, punctuated by the distant hum of the city waking up. He needed to make a plan. He was Alistair Finch. He made plans. He built strategies. He controlled outcomes. But this was a variable he had no data for. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was Marcus Thorne, his partner, and the closest thing he had to a friend, though their friendship was built more on mutual ambition than genuine affection. He ignored the call. It buzzed again. A text this time. Board meeting at 10. Don't be late. We need to finalize the demolition schedule for the North Block. The North Block, the alley, the box. Alistair looked at Lily, who was now carefully wiping the counter with a paper towel, where she'd spilled a drop of water. The demolition. He had completely forgotten. He was scheduled to sign the final order that morning, to bring the bulldozers in and wipe that entire piece of the city off the map, ready for its rebirth as another monument to his success. But now, it wasn't just a derelict property. It was Lily's home. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name. He couldn't send her back there. But he couldn't keep her here. This wasn't a sustainable situation. He needed clothes for her, food, things. He was a man of action. This was a problem that could be solved with resources. "Stay here," he said to Lily. "Don't open the door for anyone. You can watch TV." He pointed to the 85-inch screen that dominated one wall. He showed her how to use the ridiculously complex remote, and after a few tries, she managed to find a cartoon channel. He left her there, a small figure on a vast sofa, mesmerized by the flashing colors, and went to his room to get ready. An hour later, he was standing in the middle of the children's section of a high-end department store, feeling more out of place than he ever had in his life. Racks of tiny dresses, shirts with cartoon animals, and miniature shoes surrounded him. The sales associates watched him with a mixture of awe and confusion. Alistair Finch, the shark of the real estate world, whose picture was regularly in financial magazines, was standing in a sea of pink and glitter, looking utterly lost. A cheerful saleswoman finally approached him. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I need clothes," he said, the word feeling inadequate. "For a girl, about 6 years old." "Of course. For your daughter?" The question hung in the air. His daughter. The daughter he and Alara had never had. The daughter who would have been about this age. "Something like that," he muttered. He ended up buying one of everything, pointing at outfits with a detached sense of desperation. Dresses, jeans, pajamas, sweaters, shoes, socks, underwear. He paid with his black card, the bill astronomical, and had it all delivered to his penthouse. Next to stop, a toy store. He walked through the aisles, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of plastic and noise. He had no idea what a 6-year-old girl would want. He thought of Alara, who had loved to draw. She would spend hours sketching the world around her on cheap notepads. He found a section with art supplies. He bought a professional-grade set of sketch pads, colored pencils, watercolors, and charcoals. He added a large, fluffy teddy bear at the last minute, an impulse buy that felt both foolish and necessary. He returned to the penthouse laden with bags, the deliveries from the department store already waiting in the lobby. As he entered, he found Lily exactly where he had left her, still watching cartoons. But she had also found his art supplies. She had carefully unpacked the pencils and a sketch pad and was sitting on the floor, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she drew. He walked over and looked over her shoulder. She was drawing a picture of a cardboard box. But in her drawing, it wasn't a sad, damp piece of trash. It was a castle. It had windows with curtains, a door with a welcome mat, and flowers growing in a window box. A sun with a smiling face shone down on it. He felt that crack in his heart widen. She wasn't just a survivor. She was an artist. She saw beauty where he had only seen urban decay. just like Alara. He put the teddy bear down on the sofa next to her. She looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of the giant bear, then at the mountain of shopping bags he carried. "Are those for me?" she asked, her voice a whisper of disbelief. "Yes," he said. He watched as she tentatively reached out and touched the bear's soft fur. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile. And in that smile, the ghost of Ilara wasn't just a painful memory. It was a living, breathing promise. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified and thrilled him, that his life would never be the same. He also knew he was going to be very, very late for his board meeting. And for the first time in his professional life, he didn't care. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Marcus. "Something's come up. Postpone the meeting and halt the North Block demolition indefinitely." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. He had just put a multi-million-dollar project on hold for a little girl who used to live in a box. It was the most irrational, illogical, and utterly human thing he had done in 10 years. The next few days passed in a strange, dreamlike state. Alistair canceled all his meetings, delegating tasks to a bewildered Marcus with curt, unexplained emails. He spent his time in the penthouse, a silent observer in his own home, as Lily cautiously began to inhabit it. She was a quiet child, watchful and self-contained. She spent hours drawing at the large dining table, filling pages with whimsical castles, talking animals, and surprisingly detailed portraits of the city she could see from the windows. She treated the expensive clothes he'd bought her with a reverence that was almost painful to watch, carefully folding them after wearing them, trying to keep them pristine. She spoke very little about her past. Alistair pieced it together from the few scraps she offered. Her mother had gotten sick and died a long time ago. She'd lived with her grandmother, who told her wonderful stories, but whose cough got worse and worse. One day, her grandmother had gone to sleep and hadn't woken up. Lily had stayed in their small apartment until a man with a clipboard came and put a big lock on the door. She'd been on the streets for a while after that. She didn't know how long, until she found the alley with the box. It was a good box, she explained with perfect seriousness, because a refrigerator had come in it, so it was strong and kept out most of the rain. She told him this story in a flat, matter-of-fact tone, as if recounting a fairy tale about someone else. The sheer horror of it, filtered through her childlike acceptance, was more devastating than any adult's tale of woe. Alistair found himself talking to her, really talking, for the first time in years. He told her about the buildings he designed, showing her blueprints and 3D models on his computer. Her eyes would light up with interest, and she'd ask surprisingly insightful questions. He told her about Ilara. He hadn't spoken his wife's name out loud to another person in nearly a decade. But with Lily, it felt natural. He showed her a picture, a small framed photo he kept locked in his desk drawer. It was of him and Ilara on their wedding day, young and impossibly happy, standing outside a tiny justice of the peace office. Lily traced Ilara's face with her small finger. "She has my eyes," Lily said simply. "Yes," Alistair whispered, his throat tight. "She does." The outside world, however, could not be held at bay forever. The first intrusion was Mrs. Gable, his housekeeper, a stern, efficient woman who had worked for him for 5 years and had probably never seen him smile. She arrived on her scheduled day and stopped dead in the entryway, her eyes wide with shock at the sight of a child's sneakers next to Alistair's polished loafers and the giant teddy bear sitting on the pristine white sofa. Alistair intercepted her, explaining the situation in vague, clipped terms. "She'll be staying with me for a while. She'll need meals, regular meals." Mrs. Gable, to her credit, recovered quickly. She looked from Alistair's tense face to Lily, who was peeking around the corner, and her stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Mr. Finch," she said. "I'll make some chicken noodle soup for lunch." The second intrusion was far more disruptive. Marcus Thorne, having been put off for 3 days, finally showed up at the penthouse unannounced. He strode in, his face a mask of concern and frustration. "Alistair, what the hell is going on? You've gone dark. The board is freaking out. Halting the North Block project is costing us $500,000 a day in penalties. We need to talk." And then he saw her. Lily was sitting on the floor, surrounded by her drawings. She looked up at the loud, angry man, her green eyes wide. Marcus stopped, his mouth hanging open. "What is that?" he asked, pointing as if she were an exotic pet. "Her name is Lily," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet as he moved to stand slightly in front of her. "And she is my guest." Marcus stared, his brain clearly struggling to compute the scene. Alistair Finch, the hermit billionaire, the corporate sociopath, had a child in his sterile penthouse. "Is she yours?" Marcus stammered. "A secret love child?" "Alistair, the press would have a field day. This is a disaster." "She is not my daughter," Alistair said through gritted teeth, "and she is not a disaster. The North Block project is on hold. That's final for now." "Final? Are you insane?" Marcus's voice rose. "We have investors, deadlines. You can't just derail a $2 billion development because you, what, found a stray." Lily flinched at the word stray. Alistair saw it, a tiny, almost invisible tremor that went through her small body, a cold, black rage, an emotion he knew very well, rose in his chest. It was the same rage he used to crush his opponents, but this time it was defensive. "Get out, Marcus," he said, his voice low and lethal. "We'll talk at the office tomorrow, not here." Marcus looked from Alistair's furious face to the frightened child, and finally seemed to realize he had crossed a line. He backed away, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "Fine, Alistair, fine. But you need to get a handle on this. Whatever this is, you're not thinking clearly." He left, the penthouse doors sliding shut behind him, leaving a tense, vibrating silence. Alistair turned to Lily. She was gathering her drawings, her small shoulders hunched. "He's right," she whispered, not looking at him. "I'm a stray." "No," Alistair said, kneeling in front of her. "You are not. You are Lily, and you are here with me." He said the words with a conviction that surprised even himself. In that moment, defending her against Marcus, something had crystallized. This wasn't a temporary whim. This wasn't about assuaging guilt. This was about her. He had to protect her. But he knew Marcus was right about one thing. This situation was untenable. He couldn't keep her hidden in his penthouse forever. The world would come for her, in the form of social workers, reporters, and concerned business partners. He needed a plan, a real one. He had to find out who she was, where she came from. Not to get rid of her, but to understand the impossible coincidence that had brought her to his doorstep. He had to understand her connection to Alara. That evening, After Lily was asleep, he sat at his computer. He was a man with near limitless resources. It was time to use them. He hired a private investigator, the best in the city, a discreet and thorough man named Coleman. He gave him Lily's name and the few scant details she had provided about her mother and grandmother. "Find everything," Alistair instructed him over the encrypted line. "I want to know her entire history, her mother's name, her father's, where they lived, everything. And Coleman, be discreet. No one can know I'm looking." As he hung up, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just reacting. He was fighting. He was fighting for the memory of his wife. He was fighting for a little girl who drew castles on cardboard boxes. And in doing so, he was, for the first time, in a very long time, fighting for himself. While Coleman began his discreet investigation, Alistair faced a new, more immediate challenge: his fiancée, Beatrice. He had forgotten to tell her. Beatrice de la Cruz was a society heiress, a woman whose life was a carefully curated series of charity galas, fashion shows, and appearances in glossy magazines. Theirs was less a romance and more a merger. She was beautiful, well-connected, and understood the demands of his life. In return, he provided her with a level of wealth and status that even her old money family couldn't match. She was, in essence, the perfect corporate wife, elegant, ambitious, and entirely undemanding emotionally. She let herself into the penthouse with her own key, her voice, musical and sharp, preceding her. "Alistair, darling, you'll never guess who I saw at the club. Marcus." And he was looking absolutely thunderous. "He said the most bizarre thing about you finding a child." She swept into the living room, a vision in cream silk, and stopped dead. Her perfectly painted smile froze. Lily was at the window, standing on a stool, pointing out the tiny shapes of boats in the harbor far below. She turned at the sound of Beatrice's voice, her green eyes curious. Beatrice's gaze flickered from Lily to Alistair, her expression shifting from confusion to a cold, hard appraisal. "Alistair," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What is this?" "Beatrice, this is Lily," Alistair said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She is staying with me." "Staying with you?" Beatrice let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. "In what capacity? Did you finally break down and buy a puppy? Because that is not a puppy." She gestured towards Lily with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "She is a child, Beatrice, and she will be treated with respect in this house." The steel in his voice made Beatrice's eyes narrow. She walked closer, circling Lily as if she were a piece of modern art she couldn't quite comprehend. "Where did you get her?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. "It's a long story." "I have time." "It doesn't concern you." The bluntness of his reply made her recoil. She turned her full attention back to Lily. "She's rather grimy, isn't she? What is that she's wearing? It looks like one of your old shirts." "She is a guest here," Alistair repeated, the anger coiling in his stomach. He saw Lily shrink under Beatrice's cold gaze, her small shoulders slumping. He saw the light in her eyes dim. He stepped between them, physically shielding Lily from Beatrice's view. "I think you should leave," he said. Beatrice stared at him, aghast. "You're kicking me out? For her?" "Yes," he said, the single word landing with the finality of a gavel. "We can talk later, when you're prepared to be civil." Beatrice's face was a mask of fury. She looked from Alistair to the child hiding behind his legs, and a look of dawning, horrified realization crossed her features. "This is about Ilara, isn't it?" she hissed. "It's the eyes. She has the same eyes." Alistair didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was his confession. Beatrice let out another brittle laugh. "Oh, Alistair, you haven't moved on at all, have you? You've just found yourself a living ghost. A replacement. This isn't charity. It's a pathology." She turned on her heel, her silk dress whispering angrily as she strode towards the door. "You'll have to make a choice, Alistair," she called over her shoulder, her voice dripping with ice. "Your ghosts or your future. You can't have both." The door slid shut, leaving him once again in a thick, uncomfortable silence. He looked down at Lily. She was staring at the floor, her bottom lip trembling. "Is she right?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Am I a ghost?" Alistair's heart broke. He knelt down, taking her small hands in his. They were cold. "No," he said, his voice fierce with a certainty that erased all doubt. "You are not a ghost. You are the most real thing that has happened to me in a very long time." He pulled her into a hug, a clumsy, unpracticed gesture. She was stiff at first, then she melted against him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. He held her tightly, the warmth of her small body a solid, grounding presence in his cold, empty world. Beatrice had forced his hand. She had laid out the choice, in stark, cruel terms, his past or his future. But looking down at the dark, curly head tucked against his shoulder, he realized she was wrong. Lily wasn't his past. She wasn't a replacement for what he had lost. She was something new. She was, perhaps, a chance at a future he never thought he could have. The next day, he called his lawyer and began the process of breaking off his engagement to Beatrice. The financial settlement would be enormous, but it was a price he was more than willing to pay. He was clearing the decks. He was making space. He didn't know for what, exactly, but he knew who it was for. A week later, Coleman, the private investigator, delivered his first report. It arrived not as a file, but as a personal, face-to-face meeting in a private room at one of Alistair's downtown clubs. Coleman was a small, neat man with observant eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He laid a single, thin folder on the polished table between them. "It wasn't easy," Coleman began, his voice dry. "The trail was cold, but you were right to start with the grandmother." He opened the folder. The first page was a death certificate. Eleanor Vance, aged 68. Died of pneumonia 6 months ago in her apartment in a run-down tenement building. The next page was a birth certificate. Sarah Vance, born to Eleanor Vance 40 years ago. Father unknown. Alistair leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. "And the child?" "Lily Vance, born 6 years ago to Sarah Vance." Coleman slid another document across the table. A death certificate for Sarah Vance. Died 5 years ago. Cause of death: leukemia. Alistair's stomach clenched. The poor child had lost her mother when she was only a year old. She'd been raised by her grandmother, who had just passed away, leaving her utterly alone. It was a simple, tragic, and all too common story of poverty and illness. "Is there a father listed for Lily?" Alistair asked. Coleman shook his head. "Blank, just like his mother's birth certificate. It seems the women in this family had a habit of going it alone." He paused, then pushed a photograph across the table. It was a faded Polaroid, the colors washed out with age. It showed a young woman with dark, curly hair and a brilliant smile, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a pink blanket. The woman was Sarah, Lily's mother, and the resemblance to Ilara was undeniable. It was less pronounced than in Lily. But it was there. The same bone structure, the same shape of the mouth, and the eyes. The same large, luminous green eyes. A shiver went down Alistair's spine. This was beyond coincidence. "What else did you find?" Alistair asked, his voice strained. "This is where it gets interesting," Coleman said, leaning forward. "Sarah Vance worked a series of low-paying jobs her whole life. Waitress, cleaner, cashier. But for a period of about 6 months, roughly a year before Lily was born, she had a different job. She worked as a receptionist at a small, non-profit community arts center, the Alara Foundation." Alistair felt the air leave his lungs. The Alara Foundation. After Alara had died, he had poured millions into a charitable foundation in her name, a way of laundering his grief into a tax deduction. It supported underprivileged artists and community art projects, the kind of things Alara had been passionate about. He had set it up, funded it, and then ignored it, letting a board of directors run it. He hadn't thought about it in years. "Alara's foundation," he breathed. Did she know Alara? "That's the thing," Coleman said, looking puzzled. "The foundation was established after your wife passed away, so Sarah couldn't have known her through her work there." Alistair's mind was reeling. A dead end. But it couldn't be. The connection felt too strong, too real. "Dig deeper, Coleman," Alistair commanded. "Talk to people who worked at the foundation back then. Talk to Eleanor Vance's neighbors. Someone must know something. And find out everything you can about Sarah. Her friends, her relationships. There has to be a father. Find him." Coleman nodded, gathering his documents. "I'll do my best, Mr. Finch. But people from this world, they don't leave much of a paper trail. They live in the margins. It's easy to disappear." After Coleman left, Alistair sat in the silent room for a long time, staring at the photograph of Sarah and baby Lily. The margins. That's where Alara had come from. She'd grown up in a tenement just like the Vances, filled with dreams of being an artist, a fire in her belly to escape the suffocating grip of poverty. He had been her escape. A scholarship boy at a fancy university. He had been captivated by her talent, her passion, her utter refusal to be defined by her circumstances. They had fallen in love, and he had promised her the world. He had given it to her. And in doing so, he had taken her away from the world she knew, the world of people like Sarah and Eleanor Vance. Had she ever missed it? Had she ever felt guilty for her escape? He had been so consumed with building his empire, with proving he was worthy of her, that he never stopped to ask. He drove back to the penthouse, his mind a chaotic mess of questions and resurfacing memories. When he walked in, Mrs. Gable was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Lily was at the dining table, her brow furrowed in concentration as she worked on a new drawing. She had taped all her other pictures to the large wall in the dining area, creating a colorful, chaotic mural against the stark white minimalism. It was the first real color the room had ever had. "Look," she said, holding up her latest creation. It was a portrait of him. She had drawn him sitting on the sofa, looking out the window. She had captured his sharp jawline, the way he held his shoulders, but she had done something remarkable. She had drawn a tiny, almost imperceptible smile on his lips, and his eyes, which he knew were cold and gray in real life, she had colored with flecks of green, the same green as hers, the same green as Alara's. "It's you," she said, "but happy." He took the drawing from her, his fingers trembling slightly. He had spent 10 years and billions of dollars building an empire of glass and steel, monuments to his own emptiness. And this little girl, with a box of colored pencils, had shown him an image of himself he thought had died a decade ago. He looked from the drawing to the real Lily, with her impossible eyes and her quiet, resilient spirit. The mystery of her parentage was important. He needed to know the truth. But as he looked at her, he realized that in a way, it didn't matter who her father was, or how, precisely, her family's path had crossed with Alara's. She was here now, and she was changing everything. He knew he couldn't keep her locked away in his glass tower forever. She needed to be in the world. She needed school, friends, a life. He had to stop hiding and start living, for her sake. The next morning, he did something he hadn't done in years. He took the day off. He didn't check his email. He didn't take any calls. He took Lily to the park. He pushed her on the swings, feeling the forgotten simple rhythm of it. He bought her an ice cream cone and watched her eat it with messy, joyful abandon. They went to the zoo, and she squealed with delight at the monkeys and stared in silent awe at the majestic tigers. For the first time, he wasn't Alastair Finch, the titan of industry. He was just a man, spending a day with a little girl, seeing the world through her fresh, wondering eyes. And it was the richest he had ever felt. He was beginning to understand that Beatrice had been wrong. Lily wasn't a choice between his past and his future. She was the bridge that would finally connect them. The call came 2 weeks later. It was from a panicked administrator at the Alara Foundation. A reporter from a notorious city tabloid had been sniffing around, asking questions about Alastair, about a mysterious child, about the sudden indefinite halt of the North Block development project. Someone had leaked. It could have been Marcus, bitter about the Frozen project. It could have been Beatrice, scorned and vengeful. It didn't matter. The protective bubble he had tried to build around Lily had just burst. "They're running a story tomorrow, Mr. Finch," the administrator said, his voice trembling. "The headline is Billionaire's Secret Love Child, Hiding in Penthouse Prison." Alastair's blood ran cold. Prison. They were painting him as a monster, a kidnapper. They would descend on his building like vultures. They would print Lily's picture. They would turn her tragic story into a sordid spectacle. He hung up the phone, his mind racing. His first instinct was to fight, to unleash his army of lawyers and PR agents, to crush the story, to sue the paper into oblivion. That was the old Alastair's way. But this wasn't about a corporate takeover. This was about Lily. A public, messy fight would only hurt her more. It would put her directly in the spotlight he had so desperately tried to avoid. He looked over at Lily, who was peacefully asleep on the sofa, her favorite teddy bear clutched in her arms. He had to protect her, but hiding her was no longer an option. He had to get ahead of the story. He had to control the narrative. He made another call, this time to the most respected journalist in the city, a woman named Diana Hayes, from a major, reputable news network. He offered her an exclusive interview. At his home, that night. It was a massive gamble. He was inviting the world into his private sanctuary, voluntarily stepping into the light. It was the opposite of every instinct he had. Diana Hayes arrived with a single cameraman, her expression a mixture of professionalism and intense curiosity. She was known for being tough but fair. Alastair met her at the door. He was calm, composed, but inside his nerves were screaming. He led her into the living room. Lily was awake now, sitting at the table, drawing. He had explained to her, in simple terms, that some people were going to come and ask questions, and that his job was to keep her safe. She had simply nodded, her trust in him absolute. Diana's eyes, like everyone's, went straight to Lily. She saw the resemblance, the impossible green eyes. Alistair saw the flicker of understanding, the pieces of the tabloid story clicking into place in her mind. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice even, "there are a lot of rumors circulating. Can you tell me who this little girl is?" Alistair took a deep breath. "Her name is Lily," he said, his voice clear and steady. "She is not my biological daughter, but I hope, one day, she will be my daughter in every other way." He then told her the story. Not the whole story, but enough. He told her about finding a child in need, about being moved to help her. He spoke of his late wife, Alara, and her passion for helping the underprivileged. He framed his actions not as a whim, but as a continuation of his wife's legacy. He spoke about Lily's incredible spirit, her talent, her resilience. He made her the hero of the story, not the victim. "You've kept her here, in this penthouse, for weeks," Diana pressed, her journalistic instincts kicking in. "Some might say you're hiding her, that this isn't a healthy environment for a child." "I was protecting her," Alistair said simply, "from the kind of speculation that is happening right now. This is not a permanent solution. I am in the process of seeking legal guardianship. I intend to give her a life, a real life. Not a life in a glass tower, or a life in a cardboard box." He was careful with his words, painting a picture of a benevolent guardian, not a grieving recluse. He showed Diana Lily's drawings, which were still taped to the wall. The camera panned across them, the vibrant, hopeful images, a stark contrast to the cold, minimalist apartment. At the end of the interview, Diana asked one final question. "The North Block project. You've halted it at great expense. Is that because of Lily?" Alistair looked towards the alley in his mind's eye, the damp box, the small, hopeful face. "That property was meant to be a monument to the future," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But I've come to realize that the future isn't about buildings. It's about people. I have new plans for that site. Plans that I think my late wife would have been very proud of." The interview aired that night. It was a masterpiece of strategic vulnerability. By opening the door himself, he had disarmed the tabloid. He was no longer a villain in a dark tower. He was a grieving husband, honoring his wife's memory, a reluctant hero, saving a child. The narrative shifted entirely. Public opinion, which could have been a tide of condemnation, turned into a wave of support. The story of the billionaire and the orphan captured the city's heart. But the interview had another unintended consequence. It brought him to the attention of the one group he had managed to avoid so far: Child Protective Services. An official inquiry was launched. His wealth and fame meant nothing to them. If anything, it made them more suspicious. A caseworker was assigned, a no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Jennings. She arrived at the penthouse a few days later, her briefcase full of forms, and her eyes full of skepticism. She interviewed Alistair for hours, her questions sharp and probing. She interviewed Lily alone, gently trying to understand her situation. Alistair waited outside the room, his hands sweating, feeling more powerless than when he was facing a hostile takeover. For the first time, money couldn't solve his problem. Lawyers couldn't intimidate a social worker. He had to prove something else entirely. He had to prove he was fit to be a father. He had to prove he had a heart. While the slow, grinding wheels of bureaucracy turned, Coleman called again. He had found something, a lead. He had tracked down a retired nurse who used to volunteer at a free clinic in the same neighborhood where the Vances had lived. The nurse, her name is Martha. She remembered Eleanor Vance, Coleman explained over the phone. Said she was a proud, tough old bird. But she also remembered Eleanor's daughter, Sarah. And she remembered something specific. Alistair held his breath. What was it? Sarah Vance was in a relationship for a while, a few years before Lily was born. It was a secret. The man was from a different world, she said. Wealthy, married. Alistair's grip on the phone tightened. Did Martha know his name? No, Coleman said, and Alistair's heart sank. She never saw him. Sarah was fiercely protective of his identity, but she did see a gift he gave her. A necklace, a simple silver chain with a small, unique pendant, a stylized sketch of a lily. A lily! The same name Olara had wanted for their daughter. There's more, Coleman said, his voice tight with excitement. After Sarah died, and Eleanor was left with the baby, she was struggling. She came to the clinic one day, desperate. She'd been trying to contact the father, but he'd disappeared. She had a letter, not from him, but from his wife. Martha saw it. The wife had found out about the affair, about the child. She had met with Sarah. She had been giving Sarah money, secretly, to help support the child. The wife's name, Alistair whispered, already knowing the answer, his world tilting on its axis for the second time. Did Martha remember the wife's name? Yes, Coleman said. She said she'd never forget it, because it was so beautiful. The wife's name was Olara. The phone slipped from Alistair's hand, clattering onto the marble floor. He sank into a chair, the sound of Coleman's voice a distant buzz in his ear. Olara. His Olara. Knew. She knew about the affair, the child. She had been secretly helping them. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a picture that was both horrifying and beautiful. The man from a different world. Wealthy. Married. It had to be someone he knew. Someone from his circle. The betrayal was a sharp physical pain. But it was overshadowed by a wave of awe and love for his wife that was so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Even when faced with the ultimate betrayal, her first instinct had been compassion. She hadn't reacted with anger or jealousy. She had seen a struggling mother and a helpless child, and she had helped them. She had protected them, from him, from the scandal, from the world. Lily wasn't just a random child who looked like her. She was a child Olara had known, had cared for, had protected. This was her legacy, a secret act of kindness, a sacred trust. And he, in his blind, grieving ambition, had known nothing. He finally understood the foundation, the art center. It wasn't just a tax write-off. Olara had probably nudged him towards that specific charity, ensuring Sarah Vance would have a safe place to work, a way to keep an eye on her, without him ever knowing. Everything she did had a purpose. He felt a fresh wave of grief, not just for her loss, but for the woman he was, only now, 10 years later, beginning to truly understand. He had loved her, but he hadn't fully known the depth of her heart. The fight for Lily was no longer just a personal desire. It was a duty. It was the fulfillment of Olara's last, secret wish. He had to find the father. He had to expose him. He had to right this decade-old wrong. His mind, sharp and analytical, began to work. A married man from his circle, 10 years ago. A man who would have a secret affair, father a child, and then abandon her completely. A man who would let his child live on the streets rather than risk his reputation. The list of candidates was, depressingly, not short. But one name rose to the top. A man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. A man who had always been faintly jealous of Alistair's success, of his marriage to Alara. A man who had been at his house for dinner parties, who had laughed with Alara, all while hiding a devastating secret. But Marcus Thorne, it was almost too perfect, too poetic. His partner, the man who had called Lily a stray. Alistair felt a cold, clear certainty settle over him. He had no proof, but he knew. He called Coleman back. "Forget the other leads," he said, his voice hard as diamonds. "Focus everything on Marcus Thorne. I want to know where he was every second of every day 7 years ago. I want to know about his finances, his travel, any unexplained expenses. I want his entire life from that period put under a microscope." This was familiar territory. This was a hostile takeover of a man's life. And Alistair was the best in the business. While Coleman's team began their forensic dissection of Marcus's past, Alistair focused on the battle at home. Mrs. Jennings from CPS was making her final assessment. She had spoken to everyone. Mrs. Gable, who gave a surprisingly warm endorsement of Alistair's recent transformation. Diana Hayes, the journalist. Even his lawyers. The final step was a home visit, the one that would determine her recommendation to the family court judge. Alistair prepared for it like a board meeting. He had the penthouse cleaned to an impossible shine. He had Mrs. Gable prepare a healthy, child-friendly lunch. He bought educational board games. He was trying to manufacture the image of a perfect home. But when Mrs. Jennings arrived, Lily took matters into her own hands. She took the social worker by the hand and led her to the wall of drawings. "This is my home," she said, pointing to a drawing of the penthouse. But she had added things. A swing set on the balcony, a puppy sleeping on the rug. And in the window she had drawn herself, holding hands with Alistair. In the drawing they were both smiling. Then she pointed to her first drawing, the one of the cardboard box castle. "This was my old home," she said. "It was good, because it was safe. But this one is better." "Why is it better, Lily?" Mrs. Jennings asked gently. "Because Alistair is here," she said simply. "He keeps the monsters away." In that moment, Alistair knew that all his preparations, all his wealth, all his strategies were meaningless. The only thing that mattered was the simple, profound truth of a little girl who had found a safe harbor. He had been trying to keep her monsters away, not realizing that she, in turn, had been keeping his away. Mrs. Jennings looked at him, her skeptical expression finally softening into something that looked like understanding. She didn't say what her recommendation would be, but Alistair felt a flicker of hope. The proof against Marcus came a week later. It wasn't a smoking gun, but a series of damning coincidences. A string of cash withdrawals from an account Marcus kept hidden from his wife, coinciding with the timeline of Sarah's pregnancy. A business trip to a conference he never attended, in a city near where Sarah had been sent to a private clinic for the birth. And the final piece, Coleman's team had found the jeweler who had made the lily pendant. It was a custom piece, and the credit card used to pay for it belonged to Marcus Thorne. Alistair now had a choice. He could destroy Marcus. He could leak the information to the press, ruin his marriage, his career, his life, The old Alistair would have done it without a second thought. It would be justice. But he looked at Lily, who was humming to herself as she drew, and he thought of Alara. What would she have done? Destruction was his way. Compassion was hers. He arranged a meeting with Marcus, not at the office, but at the construction site for the North Block, which still lay dormant. The wind whipped around them as they stood in the middle of the empty, debris-strewn lot, the place where it had all begun. "What is this, Alistair?" Marcus demanded, shivering in his expensive overcoat. "If this is about the project, the investors are ready to walk." "This isn't about the project," Alistair said, his voice calm. He handed Marcus a folder. Inside was a copy of the receipt for the necklace, the bank statements, the photo of Sarah and baby Lily. Marcus opened it, his face draining of all color as he flipped through the pages. He looked up at Alistair, his eyes wide with panic and disbelief. "How—" "Her name was Sarah Vance," Alistair said, his voice flat. "And her daughter, your daughter, was living in a cardboard box right here where we are standing." Marcus stumbled back, shaking his head. "It was a mistake, a one-time thing. I paid her off. I told her to take care of it." "You told her to get rid of your own child?" The disgust in Alistair's voice was palpable. "I had to!" Marcus cried, his composure shattering. "My wife, my career. I couldn't. Alistair, you have to understand." "I understand perfectly," Alistair said. "I understand you are a coward, but this is not about ruining you. Alara wouldn't have wanted that." He paused, letting the name hang in the cold air. "She knew. She knew about you, and she helped Sarah. She gave her money from our own accounts to make up for your pathetic silence." The confession seemed to break something in Marcus. He sagged, the fight going out of him. "What do you want, Alistair?" he whispered. "I want you to do the right thing, for once in your life," Alistair said. "You will sign over your parental rights. You will walk away from Lily forever. You will create a trust fund, a substantial one, from your own money for her future. And you will sell me your shares in the company, at market value. We are no longer partners." Marcus stared at him, a flicker of his old self returning. "And if I don't?" "If you don't," Alistair said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper, "this folder goes to your wife, to the press, and to the board. And I will personally spend the next 10 years of my life dismantling everything you've ever built. Alara believed in compassion. I, however, am a much faster learner." Marcus knew it wasn't a bluff. He looked around the desolate lot, at the ghost of a life he had abandoned, and he nodded, utterly defeated. The family court hearing was a quiet, formal affair. Marcus Thorne was not present. He had signed the papers, relinquishing all rights, and disappeared on an extended sabbatical to Europe. Mrs. Jennings gave her report, a glowing recommendation for Alistair to be granted permanent guardianship of Lily Vance. The judge, a kind-faced woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, reviewed the file. She looked at Alistair, standing tall in his suit, and at Lily, who was sitting beside him, holding his hand tightly, her feet dangling a few inches from the floor. "Mr. Finch," the judge said, her voice echoing slightly in the wood-paneled room, "this is a highly unusual case, but it seems to me that you and this young lady have found in each other something you both desperately needed." She stamped a document with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Guardianship granted. Congratulations, Mr. Finch. She is now, for all legal purposes, your daughter?" Alistair looked down at Lily. Her face was tilted up towards him, and her green eyes were shining. He knelt down and wrapped her in a hug, the courtroom, the judge, and the world fading away. "Let's go home," he whispered. "Let's go home, Lily Finch." A few months later, Alistair stood with Lily on a viewing platform, overlooking the North Block. But it was no longer a desolate, empty lot. It was a bustling construction site. The sounds of hammers and machinery filled the air. But they weren't building a skyscraper. They were building a campus. The Ilara Finch Center for Arts and Community. It would have a state-of-the-art facility for young artists, a homeless shelter for families, a free daycare, and a community garden. In the center of the plans was a playground, a bright, joyful space with swings and slides. Lily had designed it herself. She would have loved this, Alistair said quietly, more to himself than to Lily. "Yes," Lily said, her small hand squeezing his. "She does." Alistair looked down at her, at the impossible, beautiful child who had saved him from himself. He had started this journey to solve a mystery, to understand a ghost. But he had found something far more important. He had found a family. He had found a purpose. He had found his heart, beating strong and steady, right here beside him. The wind picked up, rustling the blueprints on the table in front of them. Alistair anchored them with his hand. He was no longer just building with steel and glass. He was building with hope. And it was the strongest foundation in the world. The story of Alistair and Lily is more than just a tale of two lost souls finding each other. It's a reminder that compassion can be a greater force than ambition, and that a single act of kindness can ripple through years, changing lives in ways we can never predict. It is a testament to the fact that our greatest legacy is not what we build for ourselves, but what we invest in others. There are lilies in every city, children with boundless potential, living in the shadows, waiting for someone to see them. There are Ilaras, whose quiet acts of grace go unnoticed, but hold the power to mend the world. And there are Alistairs, people who have lost their way, who have the resources to make a monumental difference if only they can reopen their hearts. We urge you to look around your own community. Support the organizations that shelter the homeless, that champion the arts, that protect the vulnerable. You may not be a billionaire, but you have the power to change a life. You have the power to be the person who stops and sees the castle, not just the cardboard box. Your kindness is the greatest asset you will ever own. Invest it wisely.